and welcome to a passenger seat podcast. A podcast designed to fill your passenger seat with chat about classic cars, all usually recorded from my 1968 Morris Minor Peggy. But as you might remember, Peggy is away for restoration at the moment, and we are now on our second podcast recording in the Morris Minor Owners Club van. And today's podcast is all about said van. I'm going to cover a little bit of the van's history and also talk about some of the differences that I've noticed whilst driving the van compared to my experiences driving the saloon. So let's get into this van's history. It's got quite an interesting history from what we know of it. We don't know everything, but it has had quite a life from what we know. So, the van was acquired by Anne and John, and Anne and John at the time were providing vehicles for the Borrowers movie that came out in 1997, I think. And they were asked to find a van that the TV company could paint up and then return to however they wanted it at the end. So they found a van, had it all tidied up into a dark blue colour, I think it was, provided it to the TV company alongside around 30 to 35 other Morris vehicles. If you remember the film, the large majority of those vehicles were Morris Minors, and the company specifically asked for primarily dull colours. And so a lot of them are like greens, rose taupes, those sorts of colours. Now, whilst this van is currently green, that is not the colour that it went for the movie. This van in particular was Jeff the Exterminator's van. So it went a creamy colour with yellow accents with Jeff the Exterminator written on the side of it, and also had it so that the side panels could open up to show kind of the wares inside. This means that the back cab here is all painted in a matte black. That meant that any time that a film crew was sat in the back filming, or when they were kind of trying to film from the inside out or vice versa, there were no reflections, so that made their ability to film using the van a lot easier. They got the van back after the Borrowers movie, and they were fortunate to be offered, as most TV companies that make alterations to vehicles like this, to have it kind of put however they want it, but Anne and John chose to have it done by the guy that did all of their work for their vehicles and all of their body work, and they selected to have it done green. Not the green that it is currently, we'll get onto that. It was done in a paler green, and they did that because almost all of their fleet was kind of designed for TV, and quite often TV companies were asking for light coloured vehicles, so to have a light green van would be quite useful and potentially reasonably desirable to future TV options. So they had the van for a little bit longer in that green colour, but then they decided to pass it on, and their son-in-law Dave was quite interested in having the van. He'd had a van back when he'd kind of started out work as part of a cleaning company that he'd worked for, and really enjoyed having a Morris Minor van. So when Anne and John were thinking about getting rid of the van, Dave took it on. The pale colour wasn't exactly to his liking, so he had it painted the darker green that we see now. Neither of these greens are original Morris factory colours, which is quite interesting, and it does make it stand out a little bit. He didn't get the engine bay painted, however, something that he says he regrets. Dave then decided to part with it, and at the time Anne was Ray Newell's assistant secretary in the Morris Minor Owners Club, and she told the club about the fact that Dave was getting rid of this van, and the discussion was had about the club buying the van off of Dave and adding it to the heritage assets. And heritage assets is something that I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about next week. But the reasons for requiring this van were primarily it's a useful vehicle for the club to have, and it continues to be so. They use it all the time for the NEC and going to events and things like that. But also being a van, you can sign right the sides, or as the club has had done, have magnets made up that can go on the side at events and offer kind of advertising. So that's why the club acquired it. They got hold of it from Dave, and he says that to this day he kind of regrets it, and he says that if it ever came back up for sale he would 100% have it. And having driven it for the months that I have, I can understand why. It is an absolutely glorious van. But I can't see the club ever wanting to do that, because it is such a fantastic asset to the club and has such a useful way of contributing as a heritage asset. A month or so ago, I came home with said van, and when I told Jamie that it had been in the borrowers, he was very excited, because it was a film that he absolutely loved as a kid, and everyone that I have told since has been very excited by the concept that it was in the borrowers movie. And so that's my first kind of note as something that's different to Peggy. It having this kind of bit of screen fame is definitely working in its asset in terms of interesting a few people that aren't necessarily usually interested in classic vehicles and things like that. And I think that's a really interesting thing to think about, the use of older vehicles in such iconic movies and things like that does do an awful lot for their street cred, or at least their relatability to certain members of the general public. But let's get more into what my experiences have been driving it and how it differs from Peggy. Now, this is a totally standard 948 4-speed gearbox and low compression because it is a van engine, but really it's coped immaculately well with modern traffic. Obviously Peggy can get up to a slightly higher speed, a little bit faster and more comfortably, but we drove this all the way down to Brooklands and back again and had no real issues with holding up traffic or struggling to keep up with traffic or anything like that. It poozled along reasonably happily, could get to 60 and sit there reasonably comfortably. And so it has made me think about the fact that a totally standard Morris Minor is entirely capable, and I've actually been kind of preaching that to some of the young members. A lot of them have recently been talking about kind of small little upgrades where they can eke out maybe 1 or 2 or 3 more horsepower from their engines, and obviously that's loads of fun. But the reality is that a totally standard engine is reasonably capable and can be a lot of fun. I've had huge amounts of fun driving it, and I felt like its speeds and how it handles and everything have been kind of really in keeping with the vehicle. And I think if you're seeking a fast vehicle, you're probably not seeking a standard or reasonably standard and slightly altered Morris Minor. So making all of these tweaks isn't necessarily worthwhile. The other bonus about it being entirely standard is the farting exhaust, and it makes a fantastic noise when you get it to just the right speed and then lift off the accelerator to change the gear. This is not something I had ever previously experienced with a Morris Minor. Not even Miranda, who I drove last year, did it to the extent the van does. And obviously something of that is to do with the different exhaust that was fitted to vans and the fact the exhaust comes out just behind the driver's door there. But I got the van and I was driving it from Derby down to Leicestershire, and I had never heard a car making those noises, and I felt a little bit like a boy racer, making all of those exhaust noises, sometimes being able to time them perfectly through a bridge or something like that to make the sound reverberate off, and it gets you quite a lot of looks. Also, the first experience of going kind of down a slip road and the engine holding at just the right speed to continue to make the noise for a very long time was incredibly thrilling, and I absolutely adore it. And I think that noise is one of the things that I'm going to miss most about this vehicle, because it does make me smile and it does add a really fun element to driving it. But not everything is more fun than a standard saloon like Peggy. One thing that is hugely noticeable is how bouncy the vehicle is, especially when empty. The van's going back today, and so it is completely empty in the back there, apart from my kind of emergency toolkit and things like that, and you will bounce hugely as a result of that. But as soon as you put stuff in the back, so when we've taken it camping and things like that over the month, it's a completely different drive, and it is much more pleasant as a result. But really that is the only downside. Well, I suppose the other thing that we found is that people talk to you even more than with a standard saloon. There's been a couple of times where we've been sat in the back of it, perhaps eating a picnic or having some lunch or things like that, and with a standard car you might be at a petrol pump or sat with your car or whatever, and people will come and talk to you and compliment you and say, oh, I remember having one of these. And you get that with the van, but you also get a huge amount of people who kind of are still tradespeople, who might have started out with a Morris van, much like Dave, or are tradespeople and are intrigued by a kind of a van because a van is their daily vehicle, and seeing people out and about in it, they have more questions. So I think I've had more conversations with the van than Peggy. I've also caught people taking photos of the van in car parks and things like that, and been able to have a quick chat with them about it and tell them about the club and things like that. So it is a really eye-catching vehicle. Another downside, I guess, is the visibility. When I got the van, it had different wing mirrors on it. I've switched those over for the club, and that has improved things, but it has got very tiny rear windows, and if a car is very close behind you, you just can't see it. But really, you kind of get used to it. The main thing that we found is that because of the year, it doesn't have separate indicators and things like that, and so people knowing what you're doing, if you can't see them, is a little bit tricky. But I've got some ideas to pose to the club about things that we can do about that won't alter the van too much, but will make it a little bit safer to drive on some of the longer journeys, especially if it's raining and things like that, because whilst this colour of green is beautiful, it does blend in hugely when it's quite overcast and it's raining. One thing I was expecting about a van was it to be a lot louder in the cab than in a saloon, being kind of more box standard, like the cardboard door cards and all of that, to keep costs down. Obviously sound deadening thing isn't a huge problem, and you've got kind of bits of metal and things rattling about behind you, and you might be able to hear some of those even on the recording. But it is something you kind of get used to, and you start to zone it out a little bit. Obviously, if you're on a particularly bumpy road at certain speeds, then there is going to be a bit more of a rattle than you'd perhaps like, I guess, in a modern vehicle. But it is not something that would put me off owning one myself. And if you owned one yourself, you could probably do a fair few things to try and address some of those noises and things like that. So I will admit that I am not the sort of person who really understands the interest in buying lots of Morris Minors. I love Peggy, and I can totally see other people's adoration for their individual vehicles, but the idea of owning a fleet of Morris Minors has never massively appealed to me, because I love so many different vehicles and I grew up with so many different vehicles that I would be more tempted, if I had the money, to own lots of different things. That being said, having had the van, I can totally see the appeal of having a saloon and a van, and having the van in the sort of condition that this is in, because it's not been painted since Dave had it around 15-ish years ago, and so it could probably do with a little bit of TLC, but it's been kind of looked after, but is now a really usable kind of, you're not too worried about leaving it in Tesco's car park or whatever, but still enough interest to kind of draw in conversations and tidy. And having a van like that would be massively appealing, especially alongside a vehicle that is perhaps a more polished and shiny saloon. Does that mean I'm going to get one? Probably not. We haven't really got the space and the time for another vehicle, but given the opportunity, I would 100% look after the club van again. It's been a huge asset to us and really been such fun to take out and enjoy. A lot of people that we know who aren't usually interested in vehicles that I own have had some conversations with us about the van, because it does kind of pique people's interest in a lot of ways that I guess a car doesn't always. So yes, when the van goes back, I am going to miss it. If you've got any other questions about how the van differs to Peggy that I haven't kind of already covered in today's podcast, then drop them down either on the YouTube comments or on the comments on one of the social media channels, and I'll be sure to answer you, because you might well be thinking, okay, I've got this amount of money, do I go for a saloon or do I go for a van if you're after a Morris Minor? And some of those answers might help you with your decision. I hope you've enjoyed today's podcast and my little chat about the van, and I hope you enjoy my final video next week, which has already been recorded, about heritage assets and things like that within car clubs. Hugely grateful once again to the Morris Minor Owners Club for lending me the vehicle for a period of time, and hopefully I'll get the opportunity to drive it again soon. But in the meantime, thank you ever so much for listening. Drive safely and happy motoring.